All right, good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sadia Sindhu. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Effective Government, housed here at the Harris School of Public Policy. So delighted to welcome you all to our conversation today, Politicizing Prosecution, the Department of Justice, Separation of Powers, and the Executive. I would like to take a moment just to introduce our panelists, and we will get into the conversation right away. So right next to me is Omar Noureldin. Omar is a lawyer, a law professor, and a public commentator. He's also a democracy fellow at the Center for Effective Government. He recently served as a presidential political appointee in the Department of Justice in the Biden-Harris administration, where he oversaw civil rights and democracy matters. In 2021, the American Bar Association recognized him with its On the Rise list, Top 40 Under 40 Lawyers. He has taught constitutional law at the USC Gold School of Law, and he has clerked in the U.S. District Court in Los Angeles and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Next to Omar is Professor Aziz Huq. Aziz is a scholar of U.S. and comparative constitutional law who serves as the Frank and Bernice J. Greenberg Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School. His recent work concerns democratic backsliding and the regulation of AI. His award-winning scholarship has been published in several books and in leading law, social science, and political science journals. Before joining the law school faculty here at the University of Chicago, Professor Huq was counsel and then director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Project. He was also a law clerk for Judge Robert Desack of the U.S. Court of Appeals and for the Second Circuit, and for then Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the Supreme Court of the United States. Next to Professor Huq is Amy Gardner. Amy is also a democracy fellow here at the Center for Effective Government, and she is the White House editor for the Washington Post, a position that she took on in January. Formerly, Amy has served as a national reporter covering voting on the Post's democracy team. She is also part of the Post team that won the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for their coverage of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. So thank you. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Professor Tom Clark, who is a scholar of American politics with an interest in the non-democratic uses and consequences of democratic political institutions. He serves as a David and Mary Winton Green Professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Chicago. His research and teaching interests are in the political economy of judicial politics, policing and public safety, as well as applied formal theory and statistical methodology, which we will not get into this afternoon, or this evening rather. Professor Clark is the author of multiple books on these topics, and his work has appeared in a number of leading political science journals. I'm so delighted to be having this conversation with you all, mostly because I enjoy you all just separately as individuals, but also for the scholarship and research that you've done. So we have an audience here of both students, faculty, and affiliates of the university, as well as a public audience. Omar, I'm hoping you can set us up here, because some of our folks who are here might know a lot about the Department of Justice, and other students are still learning about what that means here in the US. So what is the DOJ tasked to do, and what has been the relationship between the DOJ and the White House?
Thanks, Sadia. I'm happy to be here. Well, this story starts in 1870, when the Department of Justice was founded to implement prosecutions against white supremacist Klan members that were terrorizing black people after the Civil War. So the KKK Acts of 1870 empowered the Department of Justice to do these prosecutions. Fast forward many years till today, the Department of Justice is one of the largest departments in the federal executive. It's about 115,000 people, which includes the FBI, and we'll get to maybe a little bit later of how the FBI got kind of put under the Attorney General's purview. But the Department of Justice is made up of what we call main justice, which is the folks in DC, and then 94 US attorneys' offices across the country. And each of those US attorneys' offices across the country corresponds with a federal judicial district. So here we're in the Northern District of Illinois, and there's a US attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. That US attorney is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. that person within the U.S. Attorney is the only political appointee within a U.S. Attorney's office. Back at Main Justice in D.C., where I served, the Attorney General is the head of the Justice Department, also appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate. And then there's several, a deputy, and then several assistant Attorney Generals that are also appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate. I was in the Civil Rights Division, so I worked with the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights as part of her political leadership team, overseeing basically all of the federal civil rights statutes and enforcing those statutes. Now, the question about the relationship between DOJ and the White House, that is, has had some ups and downs over the course of American history. Initially, the Attorney General was one of the first parts of the cabinet during the founding, but DOJ wasn't founded until several, almost 100 years later, with the in 1870. The current DOJ, or I'd say the current evolving DOJ norms, kind of started after the Watergate scandal. So kind of from the founding of DOJ till Watergate, there weren't really formalized norms about the relationship between the White House and the President and DOJ. And I'm sure Professor Huq has a little bit more of that history of what the relationship between the presidency and the Department of Justice is. But after Watergate, which many of you probably know, around President Nixon's spying and directing the FBI, and there was mass resignations around the use of DOJ to kind of further political ends. Actually, a former president of the University of Chicago, Edward Levi, was tasked by President Ford to leave the university post as president. He was also, I think, dean of the law school as well, and help reinstitute some confidence in the Department of Justice. And it started the process of instituting norms that separated the Department of Justice from the White House. And then Griffin Bell, who was the Attorney General under President Carter, further formalized that with some kind of rules and guidance within the Justice Manual, which is kind of like the guiding Bible of the Justice Department. Up until today, those norms have kind of stood in place for the most part. And I think what we'll get in talking to today is how some of those norms have changed, whether or not those norms were beneficial to the rule of law, in what ways maybe did they hamper the rule of law, but that's kind of like a quick overview from 1870 until today.
That's a very quick overview, thank you. Aziz, you recently wrote an article for Politico. Can you share a little bit about what we're seeing in the Department of Justice today? And then Tom, I'd like to come to you and to try to understand in what ways is that similar to what we've seen in the past? Omar got into it a little bit, but in what ways is it similar? But what's happening right now, Aziz? What are you observing?
So I would nest the question of what's happening in the Justice Department in terms of a couple of quick brushstrokes which capture some of the legal framework that's evolved and structured the back and forth over time between the President and the Justice Department and the executive branch as a whole and Congress. The Justice Department, like other departments of the federal government, is a product of statute. It's not something that's created by the Constitution. And indeed, the text of the Constitution doesn't directly speak to the way in which departments that exist within the executive branch will be operated. In particular, it doesn't speak directly to the question of the extent of political control by the Oval Office over the operations of government or the decisions about how specific cases or specific matters are handled by those departments. There is there are trace elements in the Constitution that speak to the question, but the way that those trace elements over time have been interpreted has changed. And the conflicts today are a particularly sharp take on how one interprets those different elements of the constitutional text. The most relevant pieces of the constitutional text are as follows. First, in Article 1 of the Constitution, which sets out Congress's powers, Congress is given the authority not just to engage in a very broad swathe of substantive regulation, including deciding what federal crimes there'll be and how they will be punished, but also Congress has the power under a clause called the necessary and proper provision to determine how not just Congress itself, but other branches will be structured. And so Congress has explicit authority pursuant to the necessary and proper clause to determine how to structure and organize the executive branch. Over the years, many scholars, many lawyers have leaned on the necessary and proper clause as evidence for the scope and the extent of Congress's control, not just over the content of the criminal laws, but the mechanisms through which they are implemented. On the other side of the ledger are claims made on the part of the president. The claims made on the part of the president are focus often on two elements of Article 2 of the Constitution. First, the very first words of Article 2 state, the executive power shall be vested in a president. There's no definition of what the executive power is, but some lawyers over time, some jurists have argued that this means anything to do with executing the law. Further, there is a clause later on in Article 2 that directs the president to take care that the law be faithfully executed. Now, depending upon how you think about the take care clause, perhaps it means some core of discretion that lies in the presidency. One important feature of the text of the Constitution is that it does not say who has the power to remove federal officials. There is no federal removal clause. Over time, the practice has generally been that Congress has created departments, directed how those departments will be structured, and provided conditions under which officials in those departments shall be removed. For example, the 1883 Pendleton Act, which is part of the describes the civil service, imposes protections for career civil service officers. In the 20th century, however, a set of arguments have developed and gained increasing traction on the Supreme Court in particular for a reading of the vesting clause of Article 2 and the take care clause, which would concentrate the authority in the presidency to determine not just when, but how and which laws were executed. This theory has different elements. One of the elements is the claim that notwithstanding constitutional silence, the president has the authority to remove any officer or official within the federal government. A further claim is that the president has the power to direct how lower level officials will implement the law. These claims are in tension not just with federal statutes, but with a very long history of congressional authority and control over what's happening in the executive branch. So with all of that in hand, and I apologize for the lengthy digression, one way of understanding what has happened in the last few weeks is the administration has advanced and practiced a relatively extreme, certainly in comparison to anything that has come before, presidentialist view of the control exercised by the White House over the Justice Department. Notwithstanding the statutes that grant the Attorney General an independent measure of authority, notwithstanding a series of memorandums issued by the Attorney General, which have something like the force of law since the Watergate scandal that Omar mentioned, memorandums that established limits on the Justice Department's ability to communicate, let alone direct, investigative matters. And it's worth noting that Bob Barr, who was Attorney General under President Trump in his first administration, promulgated one of those memorandums. Notwithstanding those laws, notwithstanding those memorandums, notwithstanding what lawyers would call constitutional conventions of independence, the administration has taken a series of actions, both with respect to particular prosecutors, So, for example, firing career prosecutors who were involved in the special counsel's investigation under the leadership of Jack Smith, firing prosecutors who were involved in the investigations and the prosecutions of the January 6th insurrectionists that Amy has described in her fine reporting. And in the case of the Eric Adams prosecution, directing an outcome that at least as the eloquent letter by Danielle Sassoon reveals, a dismissal that ran in the face not just of the evidence, but of the ethical standards embodied in the Justice Manual that Omar mentioned, and also the prevailing ethical rules that govern all lawyers by dint of the fact that they are members of the bar. So all of those rules, norms, and regulations have been swept aside by the actions taken over the last 3 weeks, or 4 weeks by the administration. But it is in the name of a view of presidential power that is unfettered, unlimited by either the structures that Congress puts in place when it creates departments pursuant to the necessary and proper clause, or the substantive and procedural norms that Congress has either directed or fostered and encouraged over time through its oversight to ensure that, in particular, the coercive tools of the federal government, its power to investigate, its power to prosecute, and on the ultimate facts, the power to use force to lock somebody up, or worse, that those instruments of awesome state authority are employed in ways that are directed at, in fact, the faithful execution of the laws, and not the transient, personal, or partisan missions of those who happen to hold office at a given point in time.
Could I just jump in
Absolutely.
with
Yes.
one point that kind of illustrates why at the state level you have governors and states attorney generals are often separately elected. So I think at my last count, 45 states, the governor and the state attorney general is separately elected because there's a concern of too much of that coercive power being bundled together. So there's a term that some use is like an unbundled executive, whereas the kind of description that Professor Huq just mentioned is more of this term that is being used as the unitary executive.
So, Tom, Aziz had shared a little bit about what's happening. I mean, this is just in the last few weeks. I am curious from your perspective, in what ways is what we're seeing different from previous administrations? One can argue it's an extreme over-execution of executive power, but I'm curious if there's, through previous, maybe like 3 or 4 of the previous administrations, where have we seen examples of this before?
Well, I think there are historical examples that I think maybe are close, but I will say I think none that are as extreme as what we're seeing. And the way in which we see historical examples that are close, they're not as close on the core dimension that Aziz put his finger on, which is the advancing of the unitary executive theory. This is a model of the American Constitution that is novel in modern politics. The thing that I think we see historical analogs for is the sort of use of the prosecutorial power of the law to advance the interests of the executive branch, as opposed to in a, let's say, more neutral way, advance the public interest. And so, for example, many people are familiar with J. Edgar Hoover's time leading the FBI for a very long period of American history, which involved myriad examples of scandal, sometimes to advance political interests of the president, sometimes to advance political interests of J. Edgar Hoover himself. And those were instances, I think, where we saw the Department of Justice, or at least a part of it, being used in a way that was perhaps not in the public interest. And in that way, I think concentrating power in a way that was perhaps not what sort of the constitutional design intends, or insofar that it was sort of not subject to the kinds of oversight that a standard separation of powers story might imagine. The Watergate scandal that was mentioned at the sort of outset, I think, is a very natural analog. One of the core differences to me between something like the Watergate scandal and something like what we see now is that in that example, the challenge that our system faced was that the executive was placing, there was pressure placed on the executive by the other branches of government. The legislature and the judiciary placed pressure on the executive branch. And what is the core driving characteristic, I think, of the current events is that the executive is placing pressure on the other branches. And in my read, and I know we're going to talk a little later about sort of legitimacy concerns, but the key distinction between the current events and the historical analogs is that the executive is pressing outwards as opposed to us seeing the other institutions press on the executive branch. And it appears that the legislative branch has buckled. And so the question is whether the judicial branch will buckle. And insofar as the DOJ is relatively unique among the executive agencies insofar in that it sits at this sort of interesting nexus among the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive because it prosecutes laws in the courts. It will be, I think, crucial in understanding how that plays out.
So Amy, you're in the thick of all of this. As a journalist, as an editor, we've already heard from both Aziz, Omar, you said a little bit about this, and Tom, but this is really unprecedented in that, or the barrage of what's happening is quite unprecedented. How do you begin to even think about covering this? What sort of decisions are you making in your newsroom? How are you framing this as an editor?
So the first thing that we did when we realized what we were facing and knowing a little bit of how ambitious he was going to be coming into office, although not fully appreciating how much would happen and how quickly, we decided to build the largest team of reporters for the White House team in Washington Post history. So we have 8 reporters, and it's going to be 9, and an editor and 2 deputies, because we knew that the flood of news was going to be so great that there would be, just from a management point of view, the risk of burnout and not having days off would be so great that we had to have a large team, and we still aren't having days off, even with the large team. The other thing that we did was realize that we would need to leverage the entire room. I mean, one of the sort of driving principles of what's happening inside the Washington Post newsroom right now is that Trump is the story for every desk. I mean, it may be with the exception of sports, but although even in sports, he went to the Super Bowl and he went to the Daytona 500. But you know, our local department is the lead desk responsible for covering the federal workforce. So they're taking the lead on all of these stories about the wrecking ball or the attempted wrecking ball that's coming through federal agencies right now. And we're literally taking tips from all over the federal government workforce about, 150 people laid off from the IRS and 400 people laid off from the Social Security Administration. And I mean, it goes on and on and on. And so local is a big player in this. We have our business desk includes an economic team and a tech team. They're heavily engaged because they're the lead. The economics team is the lead team covering the Doge service because it's effectively a budgetary agency right now. And the tech team is really important because of what Elon Musk is doing in his relationship to this presidency, and our tech reporters are so well sourced in his universe, that it's a way for us to dive in and source up and understand what's going on inside the Doge. And then national security is a huge desk on the national team where White House is also housed, and they are largely responsible for directly covering DOJ and what's happening in that agency. And then, of course, my team directly responsible for what's happening in the White House and what its effect is on the country, and making sense of everything that happens, and it is an absolute fire hose. And so it's very, very difficult, but we feel like what has emerged for us so far in these first 4 weeks, I guess, 4.5 weeks? It's only been 4 weeks. Is, this is going to echo some of the themes that others on the stage have already referred to, but we're focused heavily on the consolidation of power in the White House at potentially an unprecedented level, and that outward sort of structure that you described is so apt. That's exactly what's happening. Congress has completely abdicated its power here and is not going to be a player in adjudicating whether this White House is overstepping its authority. It's going to fall to the courts and ultimately the Supreme Court to decide whether the president and the White House are violating the Constitution. They are already violating laws. We know this. They have fired, the the inspectors generals at 18 agencies in violation of statute that require 30 days notice, and I think giving a reason. They've fired the head of the Office of Special Counsel, which is the primary whistleblower agency. So they're specifically going after checks on the executive power to sort of behead them. And I think I can say this as a matter of fact, they're violating the law, but what we think they're aiming for is for those laws to be deemed unconstitutional and to completely reorder what the interpretation is of what the Constitution says about executive power. And so to me, that's the biggest story that's happening right now. The layoffs and the effect on the federal bureaucracy is also a very important news target for us. But I personally think it's secondary, and I don't mean that in any way that isn't lacking in compassion. It's an important story for us particularly because in addition to being a national and international news organization, we're also a local news organization. Yeah. And that's actually one of the reasons why coverage of the federal bureaucracy falls to local, because those people are members of the local community. Not all, there are tens of thousands of federal workers around the country, and there are actually really significant nodes of federal workers in cities across America, in red states and blue states, Oklahoma City, Kansas City. I mean, there are lots of nodes of federal workers that are also being affected by all of these layoffs. But for me, that's an important story, and it's important to get behind who's getting laid off and what administrative rules or statutes are being violated with those layoffs. But I also believe and have sort of impressed this upon my team like almost every day since the beginning of this, that we also have to be really, really open-minded about what we know and what we don't know about what's unprecedented and what's good or bad. Like, I think it's really important for the Washington Post to not assume that everything that Donald Trump is doing is to the detriment of the country. The federal government is big, is sprawling. There is duplication, and there are agencies that are created over the course of decades whose mission sort of goes away, but the agency is not eliminated. There's been a failure on the part of recent past administrations to address the challenge of reforming the civil service and the federal bureaucracy. And I think that we have to be open-minded and know what we know and know what we don't know about whether layoffs at the FAA are going to affect airline safety. We should not assume it. And I think that there is a I think that there is a instinct to react if you are someone who voted against Donald Trump, to assume it's all terrible and bad things are going to come of all of this, and that laying off 400 workers at the FAA means we won't have air traffic controllers and safety will go down the drain. And we don't actually know that. And the same thing is true for layoffs at the IRS and layoffs at the Department of Education. There are so many examples. And so one of my other sort of main tenets of our coverage is to not presume and to really dive in and get to the bottom of what the actual effects are of what they're doing and how its impacts affect Americans in their lives. And I think sort of a secondary point to that is whether he's actually fulfilling campaign promises and how the country feels about what he's doing. So one of our White House reporters' whole portfolio is actually not to be in the White House covering the briefings with Caroline Leavitt and flying on Air Force One, but to be out in the country talking to voters, Americans, about how it feels and what they think about what he's doing. And one of the things that I think is really important for people who did not vote for Donald Trump to understand is that the people who did think what he's doing is great. They don't necessarily understand fully, just as I don't understand fully what the impact of this is, but they have a perception that federal government needed reform and that he's doing it, and he's doing it in ways that other presidents have failed to do. So that's a really important piece of our sort of coverage portfolio. The last thing I'll say is that the way that he the reach of the wrecking ball is a really important storyline because at some point it could cross over into real effects. Like I think there are some third rails here for the administration, and they're very aware of them. If red state voters start getting worried that their Social Security checks aren't going to come or their Medicaid coverage is going to be curtailed, that's going to be a really hot political story and perilous for, and I don't mean that in a cavalier way, I mean hot, like red hot, perilous, for this administration and the Republican majorities in Congress to navigate. So that's another important storyline that we're following.
Yeah. And before we turn to long-term implications, because I do want to talk about that as well, both for democratic backsliding, but also these institutions themselves. Omar, I'm curious if you might take us back to, you served in the Biden administration. Talk about politicization of the DOJ is not new. How did you see it, or did you see that in your service, and if so, how?
Sure. Just before answering that question, I wanted to pick up on a thread that Amy mentioned around the federal workforce. And I actually wrote some of this in a Chicago Sun-Times op-ed that was published a couple weeks ago around the connection between the kind of consolidation of executive power and its relationship to the kind of mass firings, and in particular at the Department of Justice. Part of the federal civil service and the Pendleton Act that Aziz mentioned earlier was to create a federal civil service that was professionalized and one that also took an oath to uphold the laws of the land and the Constitution. And something that was a grievance we heard from President Trump in his first administration is that the federal civil service kind of got in the way of his agenda. And so it seems to me that part of taking this, wrecking ball to the federal civil service is to say this is another kind of check on the president's power, and I'm going to kind of eliminate that check. And in particular, the Eric Adams prosecution case that Aziz mentioned was you had the deputy attorney general, or the acting deputy attorney general, the number 2 person at the Justice Department, directing the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York to dismiss this case. She said, through a bunch of memos back and forth, I don't think that there's any basis in law for this. It seems that there's impropriety, and she was forced to resign or she was fired, as well as several of the line prosecutors in that office. It was then taken to the public integrity section within Main Justice, which investigates corruption in partnership with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And there was reporting done by the Washington Post and others that the Deputy Attorney General got all of those 20 plus prosecutors in a room and said, you all have an hour to decide who's going to sign the dismissal papers. And basically, if none of you, then you're all fired. One of the kind of more senior folks in the section kind of volunteered for that. But I think part of this is to send a message to the federal civil service, and in particular DOJ lawyers who are in the courts, as Tom mentioned, executing, or implementing, the laws that Congress has passed, is to tell them, like, you aren't going to be a check on the executive either, even if you think there's ethical, implications or maybe laws that are being broken. And there was an executive order that was issued. It was kind of vague and kind of abstract, but I think it was aimed at some of this that said, the president and the attorney general are kind of the sole arbiters of what the law is within the executive branch. And I think this is also sending a message to the federal career folks at DOJ and other places that get in line or you're out.
Hey, I forgot one really important category of our coverage, which is abuse of executive power. Don't forget that the Supreme Court effectively ruled that the president is immune from criminal prosecution. And so there are already signs that some of what's happening is retribution or vengeance. Just a small example is that the federal government canceled a $10 million contract with Westlaw, which is owned by Thomson Reuters, which is affiliated somehow with Reuters, the wire service, but it's not the same thing. But the DOJ engineers thought that that was Reuters, and so there's an axe to grind with mainstream legacy media outlets, and so they canceled a contract with an organization that provides legal research, like totally nonpartisan legal research.
It's a Google of legal research.
It's Google of legal cases for the DOJ primarily, but other agencies too. So there's sort of the sort of retribution that you sort of think may be part of what's happening with some of the decisions to swing the wrecking ball. And then there's the possibility of sort of grift. So just as an example, President Trump was in Miami today? The time is a blur. I think it was actually today, speaking to a conference, a private investment development conference sponsored by the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. And he spoke to this group, and people in attendance there for private business purposes included his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and some of his business partners who are backed in part with some of their ventures in real estate development by the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Witkoff, I always forget his first name. Is it Steve?
I think that's right.
The special envoy to the Middle East for the president is a gentleman named Mr. Witkoff, who is also a real estate developer and was attending this conference in Miami with his private business partners, not with the people who he works with at the State Department or White House as a special envoy to the Middle East. Steve Mnuchin, the former Treasury Secretary, who before he was Secretary and I think since has been like a venture capital investor, right? And whose backers are also include the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Saudi Arabia. So think about the fact that the President of the United States is attending a conference that's all about private development, where his own family and friends are there for the purposes of business deals, making money, and including in the Middle East. And the president is also proposing 10 days ago or whenever it was, that all Palestinians be forced out of Gaza and that the whole place be razed and rebuilt into a beautiful resort. So that's another really important sort of prong of our coverage, is watching for the potential abuses of power.
Tom, please.
So, at the risk of taking us in a direction that maybe you wanted to wait to get to, it's to me one of the things that there is no good past analogy for, is that part of the consolidation of power in the executive branch that is alarming, most alarming to me, is that it is consolidation of power in the White House, not the executive branch. And it takes a very particular form in that it's power that says corruption is okay, that personal interest is the power. It's not the use of presidential power in the public interest. And there are a couple of ways in which that manifests. And so the Eric Adams case is a really interesting example because of a number of dimensions. So in the first Trump administration, I thought that Sharpiegate was the most important story. And I thought it was the most important story because it was so outlandish that it was like Donald Trump saying, I will very clearly lie to you by taking my black Sharpie and draw a new hurricane map and pretend as if that was the real map, which means there's nothing too small to lie about, and there's no lie that's so obvious I wouldn't do it. And in the Eric Adams case might be like the new Sharpiegate, except it portends the end of democracy, which would be bad. And so here's one dimension of the Eric Adams story. So there's this memo that the Attorney General sent to all of the DOJ lawyers on her first day, telling them about their job, and included one paragraph that I printed out because I just wanted to read it in its entirety briefly. The responsibilities of Department of Justice attorneys include not only aggressively enforcing criminal and civil laws enacted by Congress, but also vigorously defending presidential policies and actions against legal challenges on behalf of the United States. The discretion afforded department attorneys entrusted with those responsibilities does not include latitude to substitute personal political views or judgments for those that prevailed in the election. So that last part is really consequential for those that prevailed in the election, because there is, if you look across the range of statements being made, documents being written, documents being filed in court, there is a coherent message, which is that any view that Donald Trump embraces is the result of an election and therefore is the will of the people. That is not how a political scientist understands the outcome of a presidential election. And so you had recently on Fox News, Elon Musk and Donald Trump together, and Elon Musk said, if the bureaucracy doesn't want to do exactly what Donald Trump wants, we're not in a democracy. And you have in the Eric Adams case what is a very, very transparent use of the Department of Justice's prosecutorial power to induce a mayor to use his authority in a way to execute the president's priorities to pursue the mayor's own personal interests, which is to avoid prosecution or criminal punishment, not to advance the mayor's job of pursuing the public interest. And so to me, when we see this advancing view of consolidating executive power in the individual in the White House, not in the executive branch, when we equate the individual with the outcome of the election, and when we say, and that individual may openly and brazenly do anything in the name of the people, I think we have now fused an office holder with the state. And to me, it's exceptionally alarming. And so that's sort of why, like, when you asked for a historical analogy, I started thinking, and I was like,
it's like Louis the 16th.
1608. 1608 is the closest analogy. And I don't know of a better one.
Yeah. So you took me exactly where we wanted to go, which is to understand from the political science point of view where this takes us. From a constitutional law perspective, what guardrails exist to protect from the politicization of the DOJ, and What's keeping you up at night as
Méta
someone
c'est
who
moi.
thinks about this deeply, Aziz?
The glorious revolution.
You're assuming that there's just one thing that keeps me up at night.
From the constitutional law perspective.
It's like a WWF tournament of like people jumping into the ring and slamming onto me and preventing me from sleeping. Let me answer that, but then actually build upon something
Please.
that everyone else said and offer a kind of model for how to think about this moment and the problem. To answer the question, the way that I think about the constraints upon the executive is as a series of layers. There is the coordinate branches, Congress and the courts. There are the internal checks, the civil service rules, the norms embodied in memorandums, such as the one that I mentioned, promulgated by the Attorney General, and the ethical standards that are promulgated not just by the Justice Manual, but by bar associations. Then there is civil society, there's the Post, there's the universities, and other countervailing forces in society. And then finally, there are elections. So there are 4 levels. The thing that keeps me, I think, most acutely up at night, and I've developed this thought in an essay that will come out in the London Review of Books in a week or two, is that one way of understanding what's happening now is as a quite coordinated attack simultaneously across all 4 of those potential margins whereby presidential power might be checked. There is, as Amy said, a very conscious strategy of negating the force, rejecting the force of federal statutes. That's what's happening in that I think is, as Amy said, the real stakes of the funding debate, right? The real stakes are not how many people will get fired, but what the force is of a federal statute that requires the disbursement of funds and whether the president can unilaterally ignore that statute. There is the threats to not comply and the fact of pervasive non-compliance with court orders from at least lower federal courts. That should be read alongside the now bubbling claims or threats of impeachment directed at judges who would have the temerity to decide that the statutes don't favor the president's interpretation. There are the attacks on the media conducted through the FCC, the attacks on civil society, including this university, conducted through the limits on funding, the attacks on civil society organizations like Lutheran Family Services, which was a target of ugly, slanderous, and potentially violence-inducing libel by Doge. And then finally, there is the fact that the firings within the Justice Department, and coupled with the pardons of those involved in the insurrection on January 6th, send the clear signal that the sequence of events that occurred in late 2020 and early 2021, where an internal and an external campaign was mounted to steal a federal election, are again on the table. That's elections. So what keeps me up at night is the sense that it is not just one piece of the democratic structure, the necessary constraints that prevent a transient office holder from transforming the momentary blessing of the people through an election into a permanent vice grip on official power, right? Democracy is not just a one-time game, it is a repeat play game. But in order to prevent a transient office holder from extinguishing that repeat play game, there's a need for constraints that hold that power in place. Those constraints are the 4 things that I've described.
And he's attacking them.
The strategy, I think, that emerges from a synoptic, a comprehensive view of what's happening at the moment is an effort to dismantle across every single salient context the legal, social, cultural, and political barriers on the exercise of authority by the White House. And I don't think that this is anything new, although I entirely agree with Tom that it's not a feature of American history. But this was the first 100 days of Viktor Orban's rule in 2010 in Hungary. Orban enacted, I think, something like 400 statutes, changed the constitution, radically gerrymandered the Hungarian legislature, dismantled the legalistic, EU-leaning judicial structure, and entrenched not just himself, but a coterie of oligarchical allies into power, where he remains to this day. I don't think that the playbook is a secret playbook. I think if you were watching CPAC over the last few years, you would know that this was the ambition. And I don't see any reason to not take those ambitions at their word.
And by the way, the CPAC conference is ongoing in Washington right now, and there are stickers circulating through the ballrooms, Trump 2028. And there's going to be a straw poll. There's always a straw poll at CPAC. And it doesn't usually mean that much. You know, straw polls very rarely predict. Although in the era of Trump they have. But prior to that, you know, Rick Santorum would win the straw poll, and that never actually happened. But what happens if Trump wins that straw poll? And then Trump actually said something today about, maybe I should run again. And, you know, sometimes one of our judgment calls is whether to take the bait, right? We're being trolled a little bit sometimes, or at least that will be their claim after the fact if we actually bite and write about it. Oh, we were just kidding. But, you know, you said it. You're the president of the United States. Of course we're going to write about it.
I mean, there's two things about Aziz's comments I think are worth pointing out. The first is that in one of the debates, I forget if it was the one with Harris or the one with Biden, Trump was asked if there were any foreign leaders he admired. And there was one he pointed, which was Viktor Orban. He's the only one. And then the other thing I would say is that I think Aziz's organization of the challenges is exactly right, and I think it's a really useful way to think of things. But I think it's also a little terrifying because courts are not good at recognizing or resisting concerted political agendas, right? Courts handle specific issues one at a time. That's what they ought to be doing, right? They're not political machines. They handle a single dispute. And so for lots of reasons, we don't want them deciding a case, thinking about how it fits into a larger political agenda. But given that the premise seems to be they might be all we have, there needs to be, I think, some attention put on how the larger pieces fit together in a much more public way. So maybe Aziz's London Review article will be spray painted on the sides of all the buildings.
So what happens with London Review? I mean, it's a well-known revolutionary rag.
I mean, it's not bedtime reading, we've established, right?
Can I just add one thing which builds upon Tom's comment, but somewhat goes to Amy's job, which I think one thing that I would characterize as a challenge of the moment for people who are trying to tell these stories, and I think you guys are at the forefront of that, is the fact that each individual piece has its effects, but perhaps the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And trying to find ways of capturing the whole while not losing sight of the parts and not being trolled or not exaggerating the importance of the parts, I think is actually tremendously difficult. And I think that one of the reasons the Democrats, I think, are floundered, is the difficulty of having that comprehensive account. And the account that I just gave, I think when I first wrote it down, I looked at it and I thought, gosh, I'm succumbing to the paranoia of the other side, or I'm succumbing to the paranoia of people who I critique. Let me put it that way. And then as I wrote the piece, I thought, no, I'm actually not paranoid. I think that this is accurate. But it's very hard to work your way psychologically through that. And so I think all of those things make it even more challenging to think through the present moment, whether it's a journalist or actually as scholars or analysts.
So I've started to get audience questions. We have a QR code, so if you want to submit additional questions, feel free to, but I've got a couple already here. So Omar, the first one is for you, which is, how has the perception of politicization affected the department's ability to function? And I'd love for you to draw a little bit on your own experience, having just left the Department of Justice, 2 months ago?
Yeah, I think so Attorney General Merrick Garland was actually his first, or maybe it was his first stint at the Justice Department, was in the Carter administration and was involved in writing some of these Attorney General memorandums and kind of revising these norms that kind of have existed since then. So when he kind of comes back as some U.S. attorneys called him the big boss at DOJ, there was a sense of taking those norms and reestablishing them and really messaging that up and down the department. And so there was a sense from DOJ lawyers that DOJ is different than the other executive agencies, that there was this independence and they kind of took pride in that work, that yes, they understand they're part of the federal executive branch, but they also, as lawyers, have ethical standards that they abide by, and as civil servants uphold an oath to uphold the laws of the land and the Constitution. And so there is a sense today to answer the question of, can I still do that job? And a lot of kind of self-questioning of, if I'm asked to do something that I think is illegal or unethical, can I push back? It seems that the messaging coming down is you won't be able to, you'll be fired. Do I want to wait until that point happens to be fired? Want to put myself as an individual, as a lawyer who has a family that requires me to be employed? All those types of questions are going on with many lawyers at DOJ right now, and it really is demoralizing, and I think hampers the ability for DOJ to take part of that faithfully, execute the laws of the land and enforce, the laws that Congress has passed. In terms of, my experience there, I think there were times where, in my assessment, there might have been an overcorrection in thinking about the politicization. And what I mean by that is there's thinking of, if we take this enforcement action, how will it be viewed? Will it be viewed as politicized? And therefore, does that weigh against actually taking the enforcement action? But then if we don't take it because we think it would be thought of politicized, is that actually the ultimate politicization? And so there was a little bit of this kind of overthinking about how to insulate the DOJ from outward accusations of politicization that is, by all accounts from what we're seeing, is not happening by DOJ leadership today, and has created those effects of the federal workforce within DOJ not being able to do their jobs effectively.
Amy, is this what you're hearing as well from your sources around how the federal workforce is thinking about their roles?
Oh, yeah. Omar and I were talking about this earlier today. If you live in Washington, you live on a block with a DOJ lawyer, because there are so many of them. And I have several neighbors who are DOJ lawyers in my neighborhood in Arlington. And, some of them thought that they would not stay on if Trump won again, as he did, of course, but then decided to, and are sort of taking it day by day. I think very much in the way that you're describing. balancing whether they just want to walk away because it's so stressful, worrying about whether they will be asked to do something that will violate their ethical obligations to the profession and to the government and to the people. But I think that what's happening, at least in my small little circle, is people are staying because they want to continue doing what they're doing until they can't anymore. I think that's been my experience. I don't know if that's been yours so far.
It's been a mix.
A mix, yeah.
Yeah, it's been a mix.
Yeah.
So this next question I'm going to pose to both to Tom and Aziz. To what extent are we seeing in our democracy an expansion of judicial and executive power, but a weakening of legislative power?
I mean, I think that certainly, I hope I've been clear, we're seeing an expansion of executive power.
Yeah.
There's certainly a bit of an expansion of judicial power in the sense that the courts seem to be weighing in on a lot of issues that implicate power. And so insofar as they're doing that, I think they have power because they're making decisions. I don't know that it's like a magnitude of more power than they've ever had before. I think that they're just being called upon to be involved in cases that implicate the balance of power, probably in more high-profile situations than at a greater rate than we've witnessed in recent memory.
I think the way that I would frame it is twofold. The first is that in the struggle between Congress and the executive, or the relationship between Congress and the executive, there is at stake a disagreement or a tension over what it means to be democratically faithful. And there are two objects of democratic faith. The first is the written product of legislatures over time, laws. And the second is the fact of a recent election. And much of the tension, which I think is generally a productive tension, within presidentialist systems of democracy, is the tension between the accumulated product of democratic legislatures over time, the laws, which are binding and that generally endure, and the fact that there is a rotation in office for the people who enforce the laws. And what we're seeing now is that healthy tension between these two possible objects of democratic fidelity is being undermined by a very simple logic of political incentives. That, particularly within Congress, there's no reason for members of Congress to show fidelity, to stand behind laws that were passed before they were elected, maybe sometimes many, many years or decades before they were elected. And especially there's no loyalty, there's no reason to have that loyalty when many of them are principally facing electoral risk at the primary rather than at the general election stage. And so the coalition, the forces that would vindicate the interest in democratic fidelity to our laws which was always, I think, weaker than people thought, is ebbing away dramatically. And the forces insisting upon the democratic force of a transient mandate, which, as I said, can be transformed into something more durable very, very easily, are growing. And the second point that I would make is I think that the role that the courts play here is in shaping the contours of executive power. If you think back to the Biden administration, many, not all, but many of the major initiatives taken by the Biden administration were foreclosed by the Supreme Court or by lower federal courts exercising some doctrinal instrument, some rule of law that the courts generally have come up with, that limited the authority of the Congress to delegate power to the White House. So student debt, climate policy, the housing moratorium, I could go on and on. And so on the left side of the spectrum, what courts were doing was to continually foreclose the expansion of the Overton window for Democrats. On the other side of the spectrum, when you think about the way in which courts have approached questions, the Supreme Court has approached questions of not the use of government power to help, to support, to cushion the shocks of contemporary life, but to coerce, to use violence, to lock up immigrants, to
Travel bans.
to ban people from majority Muslim countries from entering the United States. The court has generally, not in every case, but generally, opened the gates wider and wider, given broader and broader glosses to the executive's powers in national security and foreign affairs, to the point where what the courts leave us with is this profoundly lopsided executive branch, one that fits in a quite worrying way into a world in which Congress is, for political reasons, not able to exercise effectual control, let alone stand behind the force of the laws that it has historically passed.
I want to add to that one thought, which I said earlier that Congress had abdicated some of its power, but I actually think it's more complicated than that, and I don't think we fully know what exactly Mike Johnson and John Thune are negotiating and getting. I think that, you know, these are ambitious and in many cases intelligent people who are very aware of the dynamic, and certainly the White House and Trump have a lot of the power because of the political risk to thwarting him in the Republican Party in primaries and so on. But I do think that one of the untold stories that I very much want to read about and publish is what exactly Mike Johnson and the Republican Senate are getting in return for basically standing down on these questions of executive power. Then I wanted to ask Sadia if I could ask a question.
Yes,
because this is a question that I think scholars and lawyers hopefully can address. I would like to hear what each of you thinks happens if the administration ignores a court order. Because it feels like that's a distinct possibility. They're very clearly pushing to get these cases to the Supreme Court. And Trump and his senior aides are extraordinarily confident that the Supreme Court will side with them in terms of expanding what Article 2 says about executive power, and that in turn would lead presumably to the striking down of a lot of federal statutes that govern what they're doing right now, the agencies and the civil service and all of that. So what happens if something doesn't proceed to the appellate level and an order is entered to stop doing what they're doing and they don't do it?
Who wants to take that? Omar?
I mean, this goes back to something that Aziz mentioned about kind of the strength of our democracy and some of the levers there. I mean, there's I forget a famous law review article about the weakest branch of government, and it's the courts, right? The courts don't have
an army.
An army, right? I mean, they can't force the president to obey it. These are partly in the way in which court orders are enforced are norms, right? And I think what President Trump in this administration has done is to say, I am going after all those norms and rewriting those norms. I think that, I forget, this was I was a law clerk on the Ninth Circuit, and Justice Kennedy was the speaker for the judicial conference that year, and he talked about part of like what does a Supreme Court opinion do, or what does a court opinion do when writing those opinions, because as law clerks, that's part of what we did, is help draft the opinions. And it's to convince, in one way, one aspect of it, the public to have fidelity to that decision, is to write persuasively to do that. And I think, right, if we get to a place where the president is blatantly, right, ignoring court orders, it will have to be the public to say, like, this is a bedrock of our constitutional system, and this is that third rail, right, that can't be crossed.
So this is a question that political scientists have spent a lot of time thinking about. So it's not, I have a theoretical answer, but it's not a theoretical matter. There's a case, Ex parte Merriman, the Civil War. Chief Justice Taney, sitting in an ambiguous setting. He was in some court capacity somehow, got a case from William Merriman, who was being held after he blew up some train tracks in Maryland. And he was arrested and held in Fort McHenry after Lincoln had suspended habeas corpus. And somehow it got before Taney, and Taney said, yeah, you have to bring him to the court. And Lincoln said, nope. And they never let him out. And Taney himself was personally bringing Merriman some lunches and meals and stuff in Fort McHenry through the Civil War, and he never got out until after the war. Merriman later named his kid, Taney, whatever, Merriman after it. But anyway, he did. So he was that court order was explicitly defied. So
it's happened before.
It has happened. Now, why was that not the end of the world? It's a very small case. There was a civil war going on. Congress later condoned the suspension of habeas corpus. The justification, the opinion for why he had to come out is that the Constitution, Taney's decision was the Constitution says that only Congress can suspend habeas corpus. Okay, so suppose something like this happens today. At the end of the day, I think the point is the court's power is the power to reason. And in political science literature, we generally believe that at the end of the day, politicians implement court decisions because their voters would give them hell if they didn't. Do we believe that the American voters today would give Donald Trump hell if he defied a court order? And so I think some of these cases that Aziz was mentioning may, in fact, be teed up to check that, which is alarming, right? And so, there are these cases with the NIH funding that were defied, and now it's unclear if they're being defied or if they found a loophole to not comply. It's a little unclear.
Yep.
Nobody seemed to care, other than the people who are not getting funded. There are these farmers who aren't getting their money for the loans that they took out. I'm sure they care. No one else seems to really be raising a stink. So we're seeing some evidence so far that maybe some defiance, a little defiance gets you there, and a little misinformation and manipulation, and you can get there.
So I've gone a little rogue as a moderator, and we're well over time. But Aziz, I want to give you the last word because I
want to hear what he has to say too.
Felt like you were going to say something, and then we're going to wrap up and go to the reception.
I'll try and say two really short things to Amy. The first thing is, I think that I would not frame the question as you framed it.
Okay.
I think you framed it as a binary, either comply, not comply.
Right.
And I think in practice, it's not a binary, it's a spectrum. There are degrees of compliance, timing. They're offering what Tom called misinformation or offering justifications, saying that it's taking some time. And it turns out that not just in the Merriman case, but actually across the board with respect to ordinary litigation involving administrative agencies, this process of sort of half-hearted compliance and foot dragging is very, very common. And so I think one thing that I would draw from that, and maybe it's a plea to the White House editor of the Washington Post, is the framing of this issue is often in terms of, is this a constitutional crisis? And I think that the framing often assumes a binary, a cut point, a decisive moment in a way that is profoundly misleading. And in fact, what the case is what in fact is the case is that, just as Tom said, they can be big things and little things, and sometimes if you don't comply on the little things, that doesn't mean that you won't comply on the big things. Sometimes what looks like non-compliance might be gussied up with fake justifications, which I think is what's going on with a lot of the funding stuff, right? There are arguments that, we have this other authority to withhold. And the fog of that means that there is often going to be no clear signal. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing I would say is I think people have not thought hard or even thought at all about how destructive of the MAGA project non-compliance with a court order would be. Why? Think about some of the major victories that that part of the political spectrum has obtained over the last 5 or 10 years. Eliminating not just affirmative action at Harvard and UNC, but extirpating the talk of diversity, which that extirpation flows directly from the SFFA opinion. The elimination of the right of women to choose whether to carry a child to term, the deconstruction of the procedural checks upon the use of the immigration power. I could
Shelby.
go. I'm sorry. Shelby count, right? The destruction of the Voting Rights Act. I could go on in area after area of law where, regardless of I happen to have priors, but regardless of my priors, the law, particularly the judgments of the Supreme Court, are a litany of victories for either what you could broadly describe as the right or the hard right. And to turn around and to say the instrument that produced these victories isn't binding law. Oh, and by the way, that may be true just as much for you, Gavin Newsom, just as much for you, J.B. Pritzker, just as much for you, Gretchen Whitmer, as it is in the White House. Gosh, that's a risky, risky move for the White House.
Well, with that, I want to just thank our panelists today for sharing their insights and also helping us make sense of this moment. So thank you all, and thank you to our audience.